Well, hello, my name is Marcus Krieger. I'm the programming director at the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County up in northwest Minnesota. And as I'm speaking today, we are in the middle of the historic COVID-19 pandemic, and all museums have been ordered closed by the governor. So we figured that we'd bring the museum to you by recording some of our presentations. For this next hour, I'm just going to be reading from the World War I letters home from twin brothers Maurice and Kenneth Masterson. Both of them were brilliant writers from Clay County who saw action pretty much everywhere where an American soldier could see action in this war. So through their experience, we see the American experience of that war over there, which is important because we Americans, we never really talk about this war, do we? And it's frankly weird that we don't talk about this war because not only is this war vitally important to America, America was crucially important to this war. World War I is the third deadliest war in American history. Number one is a Civil War. Number two is World War II. Number three is World War I. And 4.7 million Americans entered the armed forces during this war. 116,000 Americans died in it. And to put that in perspective, there's 58,318 names written on the wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The names of soldiers who died in the 16 years of horrific fighting between 1959 and 1975. Twice as many American soldiers died in the year and a half that we were in World War I. And of that year and a half, we were really only in combat for 6 months. And we all know how bad Vietnam was. I'll never downplay how bad Vietnam was. I know too many people whose lives were changed by Vietnam, and I'm sure you do too. But all I'm saying is that isn't it appropriate every once in a while to think about what our soldiers experienced in World War I? And the best way to get a glimpse of what it was like for soldiers in this war is to listen to the soldiers themselves. So I'm going to let Maurice and Kenneth Masterson tell you about that. First, I'll start with an introduction. Here's a photo of the three Masterson brothers. Maurice and Kenneth were twins. They're the older ones, born in 1896. And they had a little brother, Lawrence, who they always called Mulligan. Their parents were E.J. and Florence Masterson. E.J. was a real estate agent. Their three sons were born in Iowa, but the family moved to Barnesville when the kids were young. Maurice was the valedictorian of his class. Granted, that's not too difficult a thing to do when there's only 8 kids in your class. But he was universally recognized as being bright and promising. He worked on the railroad for a summer after graduating to save up enough money for college, and then he went off to the University of Minnesota to study law. Kenneth got a job at the post office in Barnesville. The twins were Barnesville class of 1914. Maurice was doing well at the University of Minnesota. On March 8th, 1917, Maurice wrote home to his mom that he was just elected to be the editor of the college yearbook. It says, "Dear Ma, who is the most tickled guy in Minneapolis today? Me." The Gopher election turned out very well. In fact, better than one might have reason to expect. Your hayseed son succeeded in landing more votes than the combined total landed by his two opponents. And a month later, America entered the war. April 6, 1917, after 2 years and 9 months of trying to stay out of it, America got pulled into the Great War. The American people really wanted to stay neutral, most of them. Most of us didn't want to send our sons to die in the trenches of the Somme or in Verdun. It's not like we weren't reading the newspapers. It's not like we didn't know what was going on, even in rural counties like Clay County, Minnesota. We knew what was going on, and that's why most of us didn't want to get into it, and we didn't think it was our problem. But as the war dragged on, we got fed up with German submarines killing American citizens on the ocean, and to top it all off, we found out that Germany was secretly trying to convince Mexico to invade the USA, and so we declared war on Germany, and once we got sucked into the war, America got war fever, and young men like Maurice and Kenneth Masterson eagerly joined up. Maurice wrote, "Took the federal oath today, and am now a U.S. regular. It is a proud moment when one can call God to witness that his heart is strongly enough in a cause to give it all that he has." And as Kenneth wrote to his mother after he joined up, "Rode Grandma again today. Guess she thinks I'm an idiot, right? So why does Grandma think that he's an idiot? Well, in our nation of immigrants, and we were not only a nation of immigrants at this time, we were a county of immigrants. 68% of the population of Clay County at this time were either immigrants or children of immigrants. And a lot of times American immigrants still have loyalties that have to do with their own family history. The Masterson family, they were Catholic, Irish Catholic. And the Irish Catholics had a millennium-long history of hating the English, and with plenty good reason at this time. Ireland was still under English rule, and they hated it. This is a photograph from 1916, not of a war zone in France or in Belgium, but of Dublin, Ireland. With England preoccupied with the big war at this time, this is the year before the Masterson brothers joined the army. England was occupied with the Great War. Irish patriots thought that this was their chance to rise up and kick England out of Ireland and create their own country. On Easter of 1916, the Irish Republicans rose up and were crushed brutally. Before America entered this war, a lot of Irish Americans, maybe your family if you're Irish American, a lot of Irish Americans were rooting against England in this war. And if you think Irish Americans are conflicted, the Germans were the biggest American immigrant group of the 1800s. Maybe some of you listening to this are German. What Muslim American families felt right after September 11, 2001, your family felt 100 years ago during World War I. Germans were persecuted. German Americans were looked down upon, beaten up. Their patriotism was called into question, but they joined anyway. Frank Stahl was in Maurice and Kenneth Masterson's class in Barnesville. Both of his parents were born in Germany. And the first man from Moorhead, and I guess for those of you who don't know Clay County geography, Clay County is Moorhead is the principal town of Clay County, the county seat. Today is probably about 40,000 people directly across the river from Fargo, North Dakota. And Barnesville is Barnesville is 2,500 people now. Back 100 years ago, it was 1,500 people. But the first guy from Moorhead to join the army in this war was named Nasib Shaheen. And Nasib Shaheen was born in a town in what we now call the Syria-Lebanon border. But back then, it was the Ottoman Empire, and one of the central powers who we were fighting against in this war. 1 out of 5 soldiers from Clay County who died in this war had at least one parent born in an enemy country. Nasib Shaheen died in France, May 27th, 1918. He's buried in the Somme American Cemetery in France. So both the Masterson brothers had to write letters to their very anti-English Irish Catholic Grandma Dalton, explaining why they joined up. Kenneth wrote to her, "Of course, you know I have no love in my heart for the English. I'm not crazy about going to France, but if we do it, it will be because of Uncle Sam and not John Bull." John Bull's the English version of Uncle Sam. "When I joined the army, I was what you might call a pacifist, but the inactivity and the environment will make a scrapper of me, I'm afraid." Morris to Grandma Dalton, "I have heard that you were opposed to the war. I hope you have changed by this time. I was pro-German until we got into it, but saw that I was wrong. I have not a bit more love for England than I ever had, but will fight beside the English because they have chosen the right side, the side of justice and humanity." Both brothers reassured their families, as soldiers do. "Don't worry about me getting to France right away. It will take almost a year to make soldiers out of this outfit. For my part, I regret it, but for your sake, I am glad." And then they went off to basic training. "I expect to get back all right, and in 2 or 3 score years to be hobbling around telling the youngsters that, quote, I was there." That's what Kenneth said. And besides, Kenneth reassured his family, he was able to get into the cavalry. There is no use for a cavalry unit in the slaughter of the trenches of France. He'll probably spend the war on the Mexican border, he wrote, or maybe in the Middle East or someplace. And he was right. We didn't have much of a need for a cavalry unit in France. So they reassigned his unit to be field artillery. The 76th Field Artillery, nicknamed this is a war where a lot of the units had nicknames. They called them the Spirit of 76th Division Regiment, and they were part of the 3rd Division. He was trained in Camp Shelby, Mississippi. They shot 75 millimeter field artillery, field guns like this, like you see in the photo there. And by being in the artillery, they were in the thick of the fight. World War I was an artillery war. 70% of combat deaths in this war were caused by artillery. And Maurice Masterson joined the artillery on purpose. At least he joined the local National Guard unit in the Twin Cities, and that was an artillery unit. They called themselves the Gopher Gunners after the state animal of the gopher and the U of M mascot. And here's a photo of the Gopher Gunners at the state fairgrounds on August of 1917 as they're leaving for basic training. And they were part of the 42nd Division called the Rainbow Division. And here's another photo of 75 millimeter cannons that both the Masterson brothers units happened to be shooting. Basic training. Morris went to Kansas, Fort Riley, Kansas at first. He said, "Dear mother, beautiful, hot." Those are the only two words that fitly describe this fort. Place yourself in a country of hills and orchards and blue, blue sky, and you have it. Were it not so far away and not so hot, I would be completely happy. That was July. By the time he left, he changed his mind about Kansas. Had a real hard day's work getting out of Fort Riley. Never worked so hard in my life before, but it was worth the effort to get out of that state of Kansas. I'll never go back. And for the rest of Morris's letters home, it's kind of a running joke about how much he hates Kansas. Sorry, Kansas. Morris to Grandma Dalton in basic training. I have been vaccinated and inoculated against so many things that I never expect to get sick again. Nothing but a bullet can hurt me now. Kenneth wrote to his dad, "Tell Mulligan that home is a hell of a lot better than the army and to stay out." This is the soldiers at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, where Kenneth was stationed, getting their mail. Here's Morris to his mom in October from Camp Mills, New York. Camp Mills actually was in New York, was a lot of soldiers passed through there. It was built for Morris's division. So he writes to his mom, "If they keep us here and at this marching business much longer, I sure will welcome a long spell of seasickness as a relief. You may think you've been tired, but you never have until you've done the last half of a long hike with packs on pure nerve. A fellow's nerve refuses to let him drop, and when he gets back to camp, he's so tired there's not a wiggle left in him. But strange to say, we never feel any ill effects the next day. Crawl out of bed, we're sleeping on the ground now, shiver into a pair of breeches, pull on 2 icy shoes, get a little exercise, some hot coffee, corned beef hash, and dry bread, and feel like a lark and ready for another hike. It makes a fellow feel good to be able to do it without going all in." Morris always makes time for the ladies, though. "I have managed to get a girl here, a rich widow with a big automobile. Some class to her. She's only about 30 years old. If we stay here long enough, you never can tell. I may be her second husband. But I think not, as I'm engaged to 3 or 4 girls in Minnesota. There won't be any action for a long time, and even then, not so many men get theirs," Morris writes to his mom. "And if I'd stayed at home, I might have been run over by a Ford or met some other equally ignominious end. So cheer up, little mother, and see all the shows. Have all the fun you possibly can. That's what I want, and I hope you won't refuse my wish." Has anybody ever had a service flag in their family's window? It comes from World War I. In fact, we had one for my brother in the Iraq War, and so it's even happening now. I'll let Morris explain what it is. He writes to his mother as he prepares to leave for France, "I am sending under separate cover the latest thing in military lines. It is what is called a service flag. Each star is indicative of the fact that a son is in the service. The flag is quite the thing in the East and may have reached the West by this time. There is a star for both Kenneth and myself, and if Mulligan goes, you can easily add another. So if it's a blue star, it means someone from that family is away at the war. Later in the war, they institute that if someone dies in the war, then the blue star is taken off and replaced with a gold star, which is where we get the term Gold Star family, Gold Star mom." Morris to his mother, "When you think of all the wonders I will see, the changes I'll have, Can you feel anything but glad for me and with me? When I come back, I'll have enough tales to tell to entertain you for the rest of your life. When they first get to the war, get to France, they get to see the sights. Like Maurice was writing to his mom, yesterday I came along one of the busier streets of the village, turned a corner and walked along a side street. At the end of this street was one of the prettiest scenes I ever had the chance to see. It was only a pleasant farmhouse, but it was such a farmhouse as the poets write of. It appealed to me as beauty, a peaceful spot in a world at war. It's only one of the many new things that I'm seeing, one of the things that will stick in my memory. The facilities for church going are excellent. Walk a few minutes in almost any direction and will lead you to a small village church. And they're not so small either. The church is usually the biggest thing in town. Some of them are hundreds of years old and great models of old-time architecture. The cafes are, of course, much more numerous and far better patronized, that is, by the Americans. So both Kenneth and Maurice had the misfortune of being in units made famous by this war. Maurice's 42nd Division and Kenneth's 3rd Division were among the first American units to arrive in France and among the first to go into combat. These units were in the thick of almost every battle America fought in this bloody war. And because of this, these divisions had some of the highest rates of killed and wounded. The 3rd Division had the 3rd highest casualty rate of any division in the war, any American division. The 42nd ranks 5th. And Kenneth and Maurice had a front row seat. These are some of the major battles of the war, and you can see that the very end of the war was the deadliest. It also coincides with the Spanish influenza epidemic. So you can see that in 1 week, more American soldiers were killed in World War I than we've lost in the Iraq War. It was a short and bloody war. So Maurice and Kenneth, they were part of artillery units, but they weren't the guys loading and shooting the guns. They spent most of their time on the front line. Maurice was an observer directing the fire of the guns, which means he had to watch where the shells landed so that he could tell them little to the left and little to the right, stuff like that. And this requires him sticking his neck out, literally. So this is a photo of a French artillery observing team. The guy with the funny binoculars to look over the trench, that's pretty much what Maurice was doing. I'll let him explain it. He said, my job is principally observation and visual signaling, though I have done about every one of the 1,000 tasks an artilleryman must perform. My place at the front is sometimes with the battery, more often at an observatory ahead. The observation is, in a way, the dreariest tack in the army. One is usually more or less isolated, and hotel accommodations are never good at that range. But it has good features too, infinitely more exciting than ordinary routine. I've seen things that make the birth of a nation seem trivial. So that's Maurice's job. Kenneth's job was being the guy in this photo with the telephone to his head in the front. Also part of an observation team. I'll let him explain. He explains to his father, have I told you that I'm on something about entirely different than what I came over for? Guess not. Have specialized, as it is termed, in telephone work. Like it immensely, and am looking forward to a lot of troubleshooting in the immediate vicinity of no man's land. That's the only objection. You see, the prospect of always getting shot at and never shooting back is what I don't like. I was not in a dugout during the war, Kenneth said. I did not have the opportunity to capture a drove of Heinies or anything like that, but I had charge of the communications which kept 12 75s firing, so feel satisfied. Thanks to the nerve of the lads I had in my detail, we always had communication. And you have no idea how many times a Dutchman can hit a line with anything up to a 210. Out of 16, there are only 5 with myself left in the company. 2 were killed on the Marne and 3 wounded. 2 of them rejoined us in the Argonne. There, 2 were killed, 5 wounded and gassed, and 1 died in the hospital. I can't see where the glory in this war comes in. So Maurice and Kenneth's units were among the first to arrive in France, the first American units to arrive in France. As they waited for the rest of the American divisions to arrive, the Americans were put in quiet sectors of the line and were taught the arts of trench warfare and trench life by French Army veterans. So in this photograph, the soldiers with the fins on the top of their caps, one at the top of the trench and the other kind of more left of center, shorter man poking at the chest of the American soldiers. Those are French veterans, and they're teaching the American doughboys with the round hats. So some impressions of trench life. Maurice said, the thermometer doesn't go very low and there's no snow, but there's a perpetual rain and mud, mud, mud. Kenneth wrote after a while on the front line, back for a rest now, and I don't miss the noise at all. We were not on the line very long, but we were busy while we were. Know enough to look for a hole when a bombing plane is in the neighborhood, and am familiar enough with most of the Dutch shells from the 1-pounders up. Can't say I dislike the life, but I suppose too much of the same thing would get tiresome. Maurice writes in the spring of 1918, ho hum, this is a hell of a day to be caught living in a hole in the ground. Old Sol has been out in all his glory, but I've kept my head down in my humble dugout home. Lord, if this war ever ends, I'll refuse to live on anything lower than the 4th floor. Too many rats down below. This photograph, Maurice is standing in the front leaning against the wall in France. He writes to his mother, now let me tell you my opinion about war. I wish this one were over. If the men who made this war had to go to the front as common soldats, there would be an end of all war. And it's not the danger either. That's absolutely not considered. It's the eternal dirt, the lice, the cold, the mud, the rotten discomfort. It's nothing that a man can't endure, but it's not alluring. It's so long since I've been clean that I'd sort of like a change. And think of the poor devils who have been at it for 4 long years. Don't you think they've earned a rest? And in World War I, all the boys had cooties. That's what they called lice. They were everywhere. Kenneth wrote in the fall of 1918, I acquired a number of little gray friends in that sector, and they seemed to like me. I jumped into a cold canal, discarded my only Red Cross sweater, etc., etc. Still, I find it hard work to convince myself they are gone. Maurice wrote, I've had a bath. My clothes have all been decutified, and I am as pure as chemicals can make me. Walked quite 5 kilos to get this said bath, but it was worth the effort. Hot water and everything. So it wasn't just the itching and the sores. The lice also carried diseases called trench fever. And if you look at the dates here, this is June 8. He's riddled with lice, and a couple of weeks later, he's in the hospital. Maurice is in the hospital, and he said, your sturdy son has been taking a rest cure in a hospital. The cure lasted only about a week, was highly effective, and is now a matter of prior history. The hospital was only a field hospital. My gas mask was at the head of my bunk and all that. I fell in love with no nurses, as every one of them shaved daily. Still, the cure was excellent, the food better, and the air fine. My complaint, or rather nature's, was trench fever. Trench fever is nothing more or less than grip. Grip is what they called the flu back then. Grip raised to the nth power, multiplied by 132, plus headache, plus lots of listlessness. I'm back with the battery now and promise not to get sick again unless something unforeseen turns up. But Maurice is still making time for the ladies, don't worry. He responds to a letter from his mother, you're all wrong, all wrong. You said in discussing the marriage of Americans to French girls that a kiss meant something different over here than back at home. Correction. It's just the same in France, Kansas, and the United States. I've tried it in all 3 places and am in the position to know. And besides, it would be nothing to mourn over if I did marry Yvonne. She's quite as charming as any American girl and has the added advantage of being able to buy all her clothes in Paris. And class, oh man, 110 pounds of it. In every war, letters home are important to soldiers. And as Maurice explains to his mother, right around Christmas time in 1917, here's a photograph of American soldiers getting the mail. If you give any local news or discuss any of the small things that are happening at home, you always, quote, suppose that those are things that are of no interest to me. Of course, I can appreciate your point of view. To you back there, the big things are the things happening over here. You think that we're interested in only the war, but you're wrong, and I'll tell you why. This war game and the work we are doing is our everyday business. It's our life, and our hearts are in it to the extent that we'll do everything to complete the task. After all, though, the big space in our hearts is reserved for that of home. The little things that you're doing back there, the everyday happenings in your life, are the big things to the boys over here. They're the happenings we want to know about. For example, in another letter, he writes to his mother, Your letter contained a good many surprises. You casually mentioned Lillian's marriage and Julian and Lottie's honeymoon as though I knew all about both affairs. Where and to whom was Lillian married, and how long have Julian and Lottie even been friendly? Talk about jolts. The news of those weddings took me off my pins, and the list of friends of mine who are in France was at least 4 times as large as I expected. This is getting to be some war. All right, if there's any mothers listening to the audience, you might want to put it on pause right now and go grab a Kleenex. This is Maurice Masterson's letter to his mother for Mother's Day. He writes, Dear Mother O' Mine, there are a few times in a fellow's life, just a few, when he thinks he's outgrown Mother. They don't last long and may seem trivial, but I'll mention them anyway. The first long pants stage, the first sweetheart stage, and the day son graduates from high school. But the aforementioned trousers eventually need mending. The girl changes her mind. They are that way at 15. And the high school diploma is viewed in its proper proportions. Then dependable old mother has to be on the job, and she always is. It's a way mothers have. And again, there are times in a man's life when just about the biggest thing is a mother. In moments of adversity that come now and again in ordinary living, it's the thought of mother that drives the gloom away and sets the world aright. But those are ordinary times. One thinks one knows what a mother means to him. Never until a supreme test comes does she stand out as the wonderful thing she really is. A good many things keep us thinking about you. One of them is the French mother. Sometimes she wears wooden shoes. Almost always she wears mourning. But her heart is the same as yours. I recall in particular an incident in the little village of blank that was censored. The location was censored. We were billeted there for a time, and by way of a treat, I secured a dozen or so eggs. Jimmy Thompson and I took them to one of the little homes in the place to have an omelet made. It just happened that 2 dear old ladies were living there, alone. As soldiers, we were no novelty. The place was just behind the lines within earshot of the big guns. They were weary of war. Allied troops had been billeted there for nearly 4 years, and before that it had been Germans. The home had been destroyed, and the son of one of them had died for France. Living in the partially unbuilt house in what would seem to an American the worst abject poverty, you'd think the very heart would be gone. But was it? Ah, no, they were mothers, and the motherhood in them cried out for expression, so for the evening they fussed over us and smiled upon us. No, they fairly beamed. When we left that place, they knew where we were going. I caught a tear in the corner of their eye, even though they kept up the smile. It made a big lump in my throat and set me to thinking. I had a mother just like that, and would be a fine sort if I ever complained of my own lot. And so, Mother dear, I'm thinking of you today on Mother's Day. You mean more to me than ever before, just because I need you more, and not because you're any different. I remember you as the same sweet, smiling mother you were before this war. You are the same too, and it helps a lot when things look black. It's just the same with every fellow over here. From first line trench to the training camp, every heart beats first for a mother. Every thought flies first. That is a photograph of Maurice's mother, Florence Masterson. All right, time to get to the scary part. Maurice wrote when he was in basic training. When one stops to figure it up, America has done a lot in the way of getting ready, and when she is ready, no power under heaven can stop her. Our resources in men and money are almost beyond imagination. If Germany waits until we are finally in shape, she will receive a terrible blow, and she may not wait. Maurice was right. Germany didn't wait. The German army knew that once those 4 million American soldiers got to France, they'd lose the war. It's just math. So they launched a series of all-or-nothing offensives in the spring of 1918 in order to destroy the French and British armies before the Americans arrived. And it looked like they were going to pull it off, too. The massive German attacks broke the Allied lines. The French and British armies retreated toward Paris. It did not look good. But there were a few fresh divisions of American soldiers in France. Maurice and Kenneth Masterson were among them. The eager but untested American divisions were thrown into the path of the German army, and we stopped them. The Marine Corps stopped a German attack in a month-long horrific fight called the Battle of Belleau Wood. Ask a Marine about that; he'll tell you about it. It's part of their identity, even 100 years later. The Germans had one more massive offensive in them after the Battle of Belleau Wood, and they launched it at a strategic town on the Marne River called Château-Thierry. Kenneth Masterson was in Château-Thierry. That's where the 3rd Division was stationed. While the other units retreated, the 3rd Division refused to budge. This is where they earned their nickname. The 3rd Division today is still called the Rock of the Marne because they wouldn't be moved. The Battle of Château-Thierry was the turning point of this war. It was the Gettysburg of World War I. The stand of the 3rd Division stopped the Germans right when it looked like the war was going to be lost, and when we stopped them, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, he's the French commander, general-in-chief of all the Allied armies, he could sense that Germany's strength was spent. So the next day, he ordered an all-out attack all along the line, everyone in the fight, he said. The Germans were taken completely by surprise. The combined French, British, and American attack was called the Aisne-Marne counteroffensive, or the American part of the battle is sometimes called the Battle of Soissons, after a nearby town. The morning before they went over the top in that battle, 2 Barnesville Marines met each other in the trenches. Frank Stahl was one of the 4 boys in Kenneth and Maurice Masterson's class. Johnny McGrath, his older sister Ruth, was in their class too, the class of 1914. John McGrath was a couple years younger than the Masterson brothers, but he was the Maurice Masterson of his grade. He was the brilliant one. He was the one in college studying to be a lawyer when the war broke out. So both John McGrath and Frank Stahl joined the Marine Corps, and they happened to meet in the trenches the morning before the big offensive. They talked about their friend from Barnesville, John Tusky, son of German immigrants, and their fellow Marine, who talked about how he was killed at Belleau Wood. And they wished each other luck, and they went over the top. John McGrath disappeared that day. His body was never recovered. Frank Stahl was severely wounded by an artillery shell. He made it to a hospital, was able to write 1 letter home to his mom, and died a few days later. Maurice was in the thick of it too, and he risked his life during a heavy bombardment. As his friend from back home in his unit, Everett Nelson, he wrote, Maurice volunteered to go out on the projector post and maintain communication when every line was shattered and it seemed certain death to go under the heavy fire. He stayed out for 2 hours and was later cited for bravery. The next major battle that both of the brothers were engaged in was the Saint-Mihiel offensive. So by September of 1918, the American soldiers were pouring into France. And we finally had the numbers. We finally had enough soldiers to make our own separate army. And when we had our own separate army, we had our own separate offensive, our own separate battle. It was called the Battle of Saint Mihiel. Both Maurice and Kenneth took part in this battle. And Maurice wrote this to his father. Dear Father, as we pulled out of the district and I gazed upon that vista of total destruction, the thought that came over me was this. Is Christianity a failure? No, but masonry and architecture are all shot to hell. Pretty much the truth, too, for only once besides have I seen such complete havoc wrought by shellfire. And I might truthfully apply the same statement to my own case. I've never yet been gassed or wounded, though I have had spare parts, otherwise shell fragments, bounce off my frame. My nerves, however, are a thing of the past, literally all shot to hell. A rest will put me back soon, but we can't think of rest as long as fair weather holds out. Too many Huns to hunt, and the hunting too good. As a soldier of the first line, I know the terrible cost of this came to every soldier of the line. We are willing to pay the price as far as good need arises. Beyond that, for war of conquest as the mere glorification of arms, we have not one drop of blood we are willing to shed. On October 10, Maurice wrote to his mother, I was sent to the hospital with a sniff of mustard gas and a touch of shell shock. I got very little gas, and the shell shock was nothing but the effect of this news on my nerves, brought to a head by being under heavy fire for some time. I quickly recovered and returned to the outfit a few days ago. The shell shock and the mustard gas put Maurice off the line and in the hospital for about 2 weeks. On the way back to the line, about October 6th, he visited his brother, Kenneth. They had tried to meet several times before. They often served very close together on the line, but it appears this is probably the first time they were able to connect. In the meantime, the biggest battle in American history had begun. Although Americans rarely hear about it, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive is still the biggest, bloodiest battle in American history, bigger than the Battle of the Bulge, bigger than D-Day, bigger than Gettysburg, Iwo Jima. This battle started on September 26th, and it raged until November 11th. This was the battle that ended the war. The idea was that all along the line, from the Swiss border to the English Channel, all the Allied armies would attack and not stop until Germany surrendered. While the French and British soldiers tried to break the German line to the north, it was up to the Americans to take the dreaded Argonne Forest, which the Germans had been turning into a deep fortress for 4 years. So the Argonne was a forest, the Meuse was a river, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The terrain was perfect for defense, but the Germans added hidden bunkers everywhere and reinforced their trenches with poured concrete. More American soldiers were killed in the first week of this battle than were killed in the Iraq War. The second week of this battle, same. Germany was being pushed back, but they were inflicting horrific losses on the Allies. Maurice wrote, there can be no intermission now until Germany is done. Now, dear mother, you've been very brave through all this, and I don't want you to worry too much. The end is in sight, and we'll be together almost before you know it. This is where Kenneth Masterson's wounded. I'll let him describe it. I had heard it said, and had said it myself, that it was unnecessary to be afraid of German gas. The day I got it, I had been with the infantry trying to get communication through to our outfit. Had 10 men and plenty of wire, but the Dutch firing was so heavy we could not make it, and I came back that night with 6 men. It was impossible to get communication, so everyone that could snatched a few hours' sleep. I crawled into an old shell hole and promptly went to sleep. It was the first I had had for about 3 days, so I did not hear a gas alarm, and in the morning my telephone officer found me still snoring. I left for the hospital on the 7th or 8th of October. I was burned a little by mustard gas, but my stomach and eyes were mostly on the burn. Was in the hospital 4 or 5 days before my eyes closed entirely, and of course I pictured myself stumbling along in the dark for the 50 years still due me. Threw up everything solid, so I was fed on soup for quite a stretch. Left the hospital the 2nd or 3rd of November. We don't have many letters from the Masterson brothers during this time. They were busy. All the American soldiers were busy. and their work paid off. On the morning of November 11th, 1918, German officials signed an armistice, a ceasefire. This happened about 5 a.m., but because it was the 11th day of the 11th month, the negotiators thought it would be fun or appropriate to have the ceasefire begin at 11 a.m. The soldiers of both sides waited out the final hours, trying not to be the last to die. Then, at precisely 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. Silence hadn't been heard on the Western Front for 4 years. The silence was followed by an eruption of cheering as the soldiers realized they survived the war. The war was over, but the sorrow kept growing like a wave. Half of all the American soldiers who died in this war died in the final 47 days, either in the Argonne or of Spanish influenza, the deadliest flu in the history of humanity that was spreading all across America right at this time too. Mail was slow, and war causes confusion and bureaucracy. For the next couple months, families received telegrams saying their son was killed in the final weeks of the war, and nobody signed a peace treaty with the influenza pandemic. Florence and E.J. Masterson had not heard from either of their sons in France for over a month. Kenneth, they were told, was missing. His unit just lost track of him after he was hospitalized by mustard gas. Florence drove down to Iowa to comfort her sister, whose son, Emmett O'Boyle, was missing and presumed dead since July 26th. On November 29th, E.J. Masterson received this telegram. From the War Department, deeply regret to inform you that Corporal Maurice Masterson, Field Artillery, is officially reported as killed in action November 1st. He was sleeping in a shell crater 10 days before the war ended, and an artillery shell killed him and a man named Paul laying next to him. E.J. Masterson drove through the night to Iowa after he received this telegram. He wanted to tell his wife in person that their son was dead. And as they mourned Maurice, Kenneth was still missing, and the newspapers reported it. And on January 24th, the Moorhead Daily News, so Moorhead, remember, is about 25 miles away, the largest town in the county. Moorhead Daily News published a letter from Everett Colby. He's a Moorhead soldier in France. Everett Colby knew Kenneth from back home, and he read in the paper that Kenneth was missing, and he wrote the paper back to say, hey, he just saw Kenneth alive and well just the other day. Kenneth survived the war. So how happy do you think his parents were when they read that in the paper? And they were even happier when, 6 days later, E.J. and Florence Masterson received a bundle of letters, 2 letters from Kenneth Masterson, their son. He was part of the occupation army in Germany. I'll read from one of them. December 8, 1918. Good-looking country, but the weather is a little disagreeable. The German people have been fine all along, though. Much better than anyone expected, and I don't think it has been forced hospitality. Have a dandy big feather bed to sleep in tonight, and I'm going to make the most of it, for tomorrow night I'll probably get a bare floor. I'm learning to like sauerkraut and the rest of their dishes, so look forward to a fairly pleasant time while in Germany. We are still waiting for our mail to catch up with us, and I hope it does soon. I know I have an awful bunch of it just scattered around France, and I don't expect to get half of it. I'm wondering how Maurice made it out during the last month. Know he was okay up to the 6th of October, but haven't heard anything since. Your loving son, Kenneth. In the meantime, Kenneth's mail did catch up to him, including a letter from his parents saying his twin brother Maurice had died. And you can hear for yourself how his tone changes in the next letter. January 21, 1919. My dear mother, you will know how hard it is to write anything now that I know Maurice is gone. Your letter was the first I had heard of him since he came to see me in October. But if it had to be one of us, why was it he who had made so many plans and who had so much to look forward to? I'll come back, it won't be long now, and I'll try to make up for him if only a little. I can't say what I want to, but I know you'll understand how his going has hit me. And all the time I'll have to live with these Huns, but the better I know them, the more I hate them. Your loving son, Kenneth. His subsequent letters show Kenneth is suffering from survivor's guilt, depression, and disillusionment. There is no use in talking, but I'd gladly take his place and send him back for all of you. For it's easy to see now that he had all the world for the asking and could have done so much. There's a shadow over all my joy in going home. I'll go home, though, eventually, I suppose, and live out a rather drab existence, but just now I can't see much use in it all. I'll try to write often. Somehow or other, I don't feel much like writing nowadays. Your loving son, Kenneth. Kenneth became obsessed with finding the grave of his brother and finding the body of his missing in action cousin, Emmett O'Boyle. Kenneth spent his leave searching for them. At war's end, there were 75,000 American soldiers buried all across Europe, mostly near where they died on the battlefield or in the hospital. When the war ended, we set out to gather them up. We asked the next of kin for every fallen soldier, would you like your loved one returned to you to be buried at home, or would you like him to be buried in one of the 9 new American military cemeteries that we're now creating in Europe? The cemeteries would have beautiful chapels built, and on the walls of the chapel would be carved the names of the soldiers who were missing in action. So this is the Ain Marne American Cemetery in France. We're going to go inside that building. All those words on the walls are the names of the missing. Kenneth spent 2 days walking the battlefield where Emmett died, talking to the gravediggers and officers, hoping that one of the unidentified bodies belonged to his cousin, but he was never able to get that closure. He was never able to give his aunt that closure. Emmett O'Boyle's name is carved on the wall of this building here. In the center of the picture, there's a French flag. If you go to the base of the flagpole, just to the left of the flagpole is the name John McGrath of Barnesville, Minnesota, that Marine who met with Frank Stahl in the trenches that day. Kenneth got a hold of Everett Nelson, Morris's friend from back home who was in his unit, and he got a description of where his brother was buried. Kenneth went out there. He wrote, had to walk 35 kilometers to Sommerens, but I found Maurice and Paul's grave just as their pals had left them. They are well marked. Their names are printed on the crosses. A tag is nailed on the cross also, and a bottle containing the diagnosis tag and a slip of paper with their names and organization is placed at the head of each grave, covered by their helmets. That was a common for the comrades of fallen soldiers to do in World War I. Our accomplished American statesmen, idealists, and all the rest can talk of the nobility of France and the glory our young eyes have seen over there. Ask anybody who has been on the line, and if he's truthful, he'll tell you he saw nothing but mud and misery there, and what he really remembers is the horror and uselessness of all of it. Maurice and Emmett were worth more than all these putrid, worn-out, perverted countries will ever be. I don't think I realized how completely Maurice is gone until I saw those 2 little lonely graves near Sommerens. Of the 45 men from Clay County buried overseas, 15 remain in graves in American cemeteries in France and England. The names of 2 men are engraved on the walls of the missing. 28 were returned to the United States. This photograph is from 2 years later, from September 14th, 1921. This is when Maurice Masterson's body came home to Barnesville, along with 4 other Barnesville soldiers. The community held a mass memorial service for the 5 men. Leading the ceremony were World War I veterans who had recently formed a new chapter of a new organization called the American Legion. The American Legion was formed by American soldiers in Paris before they left for home. They named their local chapters after men from their community who were killed in battle. Barnesville's American Legion, post number 153, is named for Maurice Masterson. And they were the ones who escorted his body to the cemetery in Barnesville. Wives and mothers of soldiers formed an American Legion auxiliaries associated with these posts. In 1922, 79 Barnesville area women formed an auxiliary for Maurice Masterson post number 153. 8 founding members were Gold Star mothers who lost sons in the war. Florence Masterson served as the first president. In 1934, a local newspaper asked Florence Masterson about losing her son in the war, and she said, "What a pity young lives should have been sacrificed for greed. If we had only known then what we know now." I wish I could say Kenneth lived happily ever after, but this isn't a fairy tale. Kenneth moved out to California and became an insurance adjuster. He got married and had a son. His wife was killed in an accidental house explosion. Kenneth developed a drinking problem. His son just kind of drifted off and the family lost track of him. Kenneth Masterson died in a veterans home in Washington in 1964. E.J. and Florence Masterson moved to Moorhead. After E.J.'s death, Florence moved in with her son, the kid brother, who they called Mulligan. Mulligan did end up entering the service, but the war ended before he went to France. Mulligan worked on the railroad, first in Barnesville, then in Moorhead. He got married, had kids, and had a good life. One of his sons, John Masterson, is still alive. He's a retired teacher in California. The photos that you see in this presentation of the Masterson family were mailed to us by him. Then in 1981, after everyone in this presentation had died of old age, the family donated the war letters of Kenneth and Maurice Masterson to the archive at Minnesota State University Moorhead, so people can read them in the future. People like me and people like you and people like every sixth grader in Minnesota. This photo over here is from the sixth grade Minnesota history textbook, Northern Lights. They use Maurice's words to teach our children about this war. I'll let Maurice have the last words in this presentation. He says, as per usual, he writes to his mother, there's nothing much to say. That is, there are a million things I want to tell you, things I'm just bursting to spill to someone, but there's no way to get them out of my system. Someday, if this war ever ends, I'll regale you with 1,000 tales, and you'll want to hear them too, for there'll be stories of human nature seen as only war can make it show itself. If I could but clearly portray the ordeals, the tragedy, the pathos of war, as well as its humor, I could give to some, at least, a great condemnation of militarism. But that is impossible. There is no mind great enough to cover the subject. All I can do is retain the impressions the war has made upon me as an individual. You will know their effects when you see me without any telling. Only one thing will I say. War soils everything it touches, save for the men who fight the war. For them, if they pass through it, they have tasted of life from the sparkling surface to the bitterest dregs.